Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Young people, good afternoon, and welcome to the first annual Kenneth E. Robinson Cyril Packwood Memorial Lecture. This is being put on by the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs, and we extend a very special welcome to all of you, to our honorary guests, Mrs. Dorothy Packwood and Mrs. Rosalind Robinson, the ladies who stood by the gentleman in whose memory this lecture is being held. We also extend a very special lecture to our guest speakers, Dr. Clarence Maxwell, a son of the soil, and Dr. Radal Tankard, another son of the soil. We are especially pleased that for this, the first annual Kenneth E. Robinson Cyril Packwood Memorial Lecture, we have two young men who are sons of the soil, who have achieved in their own right and have distinguished themselves. And so we are pleased that they are here for this inaugural lecture. And we are also pleased that we have so many young people here. Certainly when you hear these gentlemen speak and when you hear of their accomplishments, you can be inspired to know that that too is something you can achieve and work towards. This afternoon, our minister, the Honorable Wayne Parent-Chief, will be arriving in another half an hour. He sends his apologies for not being here as early as he would like. He's triple booked, so we're his second event for the afternoon. He will be arriving in time for us to make the presentations. The program is going to be followed as it's laid out on your table. We will have lunch, and then we will have the biographies read of the two men after whom this lecture is being named. And that will be followed by the speakers, and then we will have a question and answer period. Let me say that we are having this lecture named after Dr. Kenneth Robinson and Mr. Cyril Packwood because the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs, like the government of the day, believes that it must honor its heroes. We have many unsung heroes of whom people know little. And this is but one way of recognizing the worth and the work of such people. Dr. Robinson and Mr. Cyril Packwood certainly were giants, scholarly giants in our community. And we are indebted to them for the work that they've done, for their worth, and the value that they have brought to helping us have a little more appreciation for our history and our cultural heritage. So it is most fitting that we have this lecture named in honor of them. And we are so pleased to have Dr. Kenneth Robinson's wife, Mrs. Rosalind Robinson, my former principal, Frances Patton, and her granddaughter, Mrs. Shirley Pearman, and her husband, Mr. Roderick Pearman. Her daughter, apologies, her daughter, Mrs. Shirley Pearman, and grandson, Michael, and Mr. Roderick Pearman. And we're equally pleased to welcome Mrs. Dorothy Packwood, the wife of Mr. Cyril Packwood, their daughter, and her son. So without me taking up any more time, we're going to invite the guests, the honorees, and the guest tables to first go to the buffet line, and the rest can follow after, and we will partake of some delicious food that's being provided by the Royal Amateur Hamilton Dinghy Club, and then we will begin the lectures. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence here this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ms. Whalen, Dr. Kim Dismont-Robinson, other members of the Ministry, the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon, and we certainly hope that this becomes an annual event. My grandfather, the late Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson, was the only child of Olivia and Hilton Robinson of Marsh Folly Road, Pembroke North, Bermuda. I am told that he exhibited scholarly traits from an early age. Born in 1911, he excelled in his studies and won the Bermuda Technical Scholarship at the age of 20. In 1936, he obtained his Bachelor of Science honors degree from University College London. His academic pursuits paralleled his marriage to Rosalind Robinson in 1936 and the birth of his two children, Shirley and Kenneth Edward. There were advanced studies in the UK, Cambridge, Massachusetts, along with teaching and principalships in Bermuda. One of his ultimate goals was realized in 1952 when he obtained his doctorate in education from Harvard University. He has the distinction of being the first Bermudian to obtain this qualification. Combining his education career with his passion for historical research and writing, my grandfather embarked on a 20-year quest to compile primary sources which would, quote, write black people into the history of Bermuda. The first of 4 volumes, Heritage 1834 to 1859, was published posthumously. Always have difficulty with that word. My grandfather retired as Bermuda's first chief education officer in 1976, one of a succession of firsts which enabled him to pave the way for others to follow. It may be of interest to you to know that my grandfather mentored Mr. Cyril Packwood. There are far more academics today in 2006 than there were 30 years ago. My mother recalls Mr. Packwood's visits to my grandfather's home, where much discussion and conferring took place regarding Mr. Packwood's research for his book, Chained on the Rock. The fact that my grandfather wrote the preface, and in his masterful way with words, he concisely describes the contents, as well as his pleasure with being associated with the voluminous treaty. Mr. Packwood, in turn, expressed his sentiments in an autographed copy dated January 2nd, 1976. To Dr. Kenneth Robinson, in appreciation for all your help and valuable suggestions in making this book possible, Cyril Packwood. The family is very happy to have my grandfather's name associated with an historical lecture series, and my grandfather would be ecstatic to know that young men of the caliber of Drs. Maxwell and Tankard have taken up the mantle. Thank you.
Good afternoon, honored guests. Thank you very much, Ms. Whalen, and also please convey our thanks to Dr. Dismont Robinson and the minister. It is an honor to be here. It is an honor to have my father honored along with Dr. Kenneth Robinson. And with that, I guess I will start the biography. Cyril Atterbridge Packwood was born in Bermuda on November 22nd, 1930, to Cyril and Gladys Packwood. My grandfather loved to tell the story of how he was the first successful cesarean birth in Bermuda. I guess for someone who would have such a remarkable life and offer so much that was remarkable, it was only fitting that he would have such a remarkable start to his life. He grew up as an only child in Wellington, St. George's, and attended East End Primary, Temperance Hall, and Berkeley Institute. He left Bermuda at the age of 15 to finish high school in the United States. He earned his bachelor's in history from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee in 1953, and a master's of science degree in library science from Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio in 1954. He later received a second master's from the City University of New York in 1972. When my father first went off to school, he was going to study chemistry and become a dentist. At Fisk, he met and was mentored by Arnold Bontemps, the famous writer and historian from the Harlem Renaissance, and also chief librarian at Fisk University. That relationship would shape the course of his life, a life which would end up giving so much back to the community and from which he came. He ended up spending most of his professional life in New York City, where he worked for the New York Public Library from 1957 to 1968, where he was the head librarian at County Cullen Library in Harlem, and then at the Borough of Manhattan Community College Library, where he was the chief librarian. He had always wanted to return to Bermuda to work and live, but the opportunities did not exist in Bermuda during that time of practical segregation for a black male Bermudian who wanted to be a librarian. I knew, nevertheless, that one day he would return to his island home. When the position of chief librarian of the Bermuda Public Libraries opened in 1985, I knew that finally his dream would come true. He remained there until his retirement in 1993. He authored 2 books on Bermuda history and numerous articles which were published. Chained on the Rock was first published in 1975 and to this day is known as the foremost treatise on slavery in Bermuda. He also published in 1977 Detour Bermuda, Destination U.S. House of Representatives, The Life of Joseph Rainey. And as Mr. Pearman pointed out, Dr. Kenneth Robinson authored the preface in Chained on the Rock, and we are proud today to be associated with such a historic and famous family on the island. My father's interests were eclectic. He fell in love with the African continent on his first trip to the continent in 1974. He ended up returning every year, sometimes 2 and 3 times a year for the rest of his life. He loved plants and gardening. He was an avid railroad expert and collected just about every piece of paper on railroads throughout the world. He also loved boats and served on the Bermuda Government Committee for Marine and Ports. He was a Rotarian. He worked with the Bermuda Aquarium and Zoological Society and was a docent at the National Art Gallery. His interests and contributions are endless, it would seem, and I always became exhausted when I would hear him discuss his day. My father died in 1998 after a brief illness, but not without having loved my beautiful mother, Dorothy Isabel Packwood, and having held and nurtured his 3 grandsons, one of whom is here today, Hamidi Gaggio, and the other 2, Kibir, Cyril, and Haruna. When we read a biography of a person, we often forget the aspects of their life that make them the person we all loved. He was more than dates and degrees. My father had a smile and a kind word for everyone he met. He lived a full and wonderful life and loved the people he met during this earthly sojourn. So thank you today, and I look forward to the speeches that are coming.
Ms. Packwood, Mr. Pearman, thank you both for reading the biographies of these giants in Bermuda's intellectual and scholarly world. We acknowledge the presence of our minister, the Honorable Wayne Parentchief, who has just joined us, sir. Thank you for being here. We will hear from him later, but he's just in time not only for the good food, but he's in time for some excellent lectures, first by Dr. Clarence Maxwell and then by Dr. Ray Dowd-Hankard. I will briefly give a synopsis of Dr. Clarence Maxwell's bio, who is our first speaker today. Dr. Clarence Maxwell is presently Assistant Professor for Caribbean and Latin American History at Millersville University of Pennsylvania. He was formerly the Registrar and Director of Historical Research at the Bermuda Maritime Museum from 1999 to 2005. Presently serves as the editor of the Bermuda Journal of Archaeological and Maritime History, the academic journal of the Bermuda Maritime Museum. His research specialty is the slavery and the African diaspora. He has presently published several articles, principally The Horrid Villainy, Sarah Bassett and the Poisoning Conspiracies in Bermuda, 1727 to 1730, for Slavery and Abolition, and with Dr. Clifford Smith, Jr., A Bermuda Smuggling Slave Trade, The Manila Wreck Opens Pandora's Box, also for Slavery and Abolition. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Clarence Maxwell.
Packwood and Robinson families. Packwood and Robinson families, thank you. Honorable Minister, honorable guest. I'm going to tell a story. It happened in 1761. It began on the evening of October 12th. John Vickers, a Hamilton Parish mariner, was walking one evening somewhere around Smith's Parish, and he heard about a servile revolt. He overheard 6 to 8 men talking amongst each other. One of these men was a young fellow by the name of Nat, the loudest, excuse me, my cold may get the best of me. One of the downsides of living in Pennsylvania, the only downside. One of them was a young man by the name of Nat, he was the property of Thomas Cox. He said, and I quote, Nat said quite staunchly, "I possess a cow and, quote, no white body will have any of it, and he will have a frolic with this revolt. That will be his wife's and his part in it." It was left ambiguous. Another person said that he will kill anyone who should try to take his property from him. Another man said, his voice coming out of the gloom, that indeed there would be a great victory here soon, or if not half to two-thirds of the Negroes will be hanged in Bermuda. Vickers then suddenly remembered a pilot, a black pilot by the name of Peter, who said that if anybody should take any clothes from him, he will be avenged. A long time ago, a professor once told me to try to find the big picture. What is the big question? The big question in this is essentially that we're talking about a feudal plantocracy that ran afoul of a growing capitalist orientation in Bermuda's 18th century economy. A commercial revolution that was incompatible with a feudal and slaveocracy. The embodiment of this contradiction was the enslaved merchant mariner, an 18th century creation of the fusion of these two economies. The opportunity for the violent expression of this contradiction would be the conspiracy of 1761. So, I will examine the context for that revolt, its international and local context. I will introduce you and meet the actors both for and against, those who tried to promote the revolt and those who tried to squash it, or at least the one particular individual who attempted to squash it, a man by the name of Governor William Popple, the evil genius, if you like, behind the termination of it. And finally, I use the term evil affectionately. And finally, I will outline the rise and fall of this conspiracy, how it rose, and what brought it to an end. Let me start with the context. When we talk about slave revolts, we always treat them as if there's some sort of a pie recipe. You put a little bit of demographic problems, you put in, you put in demographic issues, you throw in issues concerning rising expectations. You take a look at the conflicts between local and international elites. This one is no different, and oddly enough, all of those elements were present except for one, the issue of demography. But for one thing, it was clear there was a division between the international and local elite, and this is that international division that was what made it possible for a movement toward revolt, as well as a bit of local conflicts. Throughout the 18th century, this division was particularly fought between France and Britain in their global attempt to dominate the world. No less than 4, 5, perhaps 6 revolts were fought, wars were fought between these two combatants. They literally battled each other across the world. They fought themselves. They were in India, they were in the Caribbean, they were in North America. Anywhere the two showed up, they were going to be at each other's throats. It was like a high school. Battle after battle after battle, these two institutions, these two organizations fought and fought. The War of the Peace of Augsburg, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, the Anglo-American Revolution, the French Revolution, all of these were wars which the two combatants fought each other. The aim was domination of the world. They placed series of restrictions on each other to thwart each other's trade. 1756 to 63 saw a new conflict, the 7 Years' War, on the so-called French and Indian Wars. To understand the aim of the conspirators, one must see this conflict as a conspiracy, particularly in light of the fact that 1761 occurs right in the middle of one of these wars. That takes care of the international context. Let's take care of the local. By the end of 1684, the Somers Island Company rule had come to an end. There was a radical expansion in Bermuda's maritime economy. Commerce and smuggling would emerge, particularly during the 18th century, as Bermudians began to become involved in trade. Warfare was these wars in particular were reflections of this situation. The emergence of a maritime commercial revolution was the consequence. And this revolution, this economy, would dominate until 1815. Entered bond people. They use the term slaves. Slaves carries this rather odious impression of powerlessness and lack of agency. Bond people still maintains the agency and while still recognizing the condition. Bond people, many of them became merchant sailors, particularly, but let's understand what they were as bond people. From 1623 onward, there were attempts to try to control their economy with the process of trying to extract their economy for the benefit of slaveholders. 1623, the Law Act to Restrain the Insolence of the Negroes was passed, the first such legislation toward this end, forbid trade as well as self-provisioning to prevent masters from competing with slaves over the valuable tobacco crop. By 1619, new laws would be confirmed, making Bermuda one of the strictest societies in terms of the expropriation of slave capital for the benefit of slaveholders. Laws were passed to forbid independent trading, but what was most important was that anything that the slaves occupied, anything the bond people occupied, was to be the property of slaveholders. The point was that the legislation, although there were these laws, invariably these laws were not enforced. Their lack of enforcement was due to a whole lot of things. This is the way the society was in law, but in reality, the situation was different. It was difficult to enforce these laws. Many times, slaveholders could be bothered. More than likely, there was no enforcement and infrastructural development to the extent that they could actually stop it. Slaves, therefore, used the breach to make an economy for themselves. Developed capital, oftentimes unknown to their owners. In practice, they violated a law, and that practice, they came to conceive of this property as their property. That was reflected in the statements made by the men. Somebody takes something that belongs to me, I will be avenged. Somebody removes something that belongs to me, I will do something about it. The conspiracy was reflecting a reality that this property was now conceived as their property. This went in tandem with wages, which were given to slaves, and sooner over time, these too were conceived as property. Then one more factor would add to this problem, and that is the Maritime Revolution. By the 1700s, the War of the Spanish Succession, Britain obtained the asiento, allowing for a rise in British involvement in trade, but also, right after 1715, a decline in Britain's economy, a wartime economy. A large number of men, as Pirates of the Caribbean will make clear, decided that they were going to find other ways of fighting a maritime system that was exploiting them. Large numbers of white men became pirates. Large numbers of them attacked English shipping across the ocean. There was concern that Bermudian men would take up the same thing, that many of them were now leaving the country, and they too would join these pirate crews. It would have been nice to see some Johnny Depp being played by a Bermudian playing Johnny Depp, but anyway. Could it possibly have been that? As both Packwood and Robinson and other historians have noted, fear had caused the passage of the 1719 law, which forbade white men from entering sloops. Black men filled the breach. Between 1708 and 1720, 28% of the crews were black. By 1720, 34% of the crews were black. By 1773 to 1774, 40% of all black men in Bermuda, flipping the statistics a bit, but 40% of all black men in Bermuda, according to Elaine Foreman Crane, 40% of all black men in Bermuda were sailors. This was an expansive and dramatic entry for them into a profitable maritime economy, which radically extended the reach of their local economies. What came out of this? The tangibles, trade with the Atlantic world, prizes that came from preying upon ships as privateermen, and of course from smuggling, disappearing with sloops from at least one situation, going from Turk's Island to Saint-Domingue, which was totally illegal, trading with the people in Saint-Domingue, taking your goods elsewhere, which was totally illegal, and then sailing back to Bermuda as if you didn't have anything, but making sure your profits were secured elsewhere. Slaveholders cared but didn't care. Whatever makes the system work. But for the most part, the profits that they were making were being conceived as their property. After all, the slaveholders themselves were involved in the smuggling, so why should they be bothered? Everybody was happy except, of course, the British government. But as one slaveholder felt, they probably will get over it. The intangibles of the system were clear. Ideologies passed along these waters. New religious movements such as Obeah and Vodun fused together in place of Bermuda. If you take a look slowly, carefully at the Sarabassa revolt, it has elements of both. And Gombeism arrived in Bermuda in the 18th century as a result of this trade. Radicalism, news of revolts throughout the Caribbean were also clear. News of slave rebellions in the Caribbean, such as Saint-Domingue in the 1750s, and the Mackandal revolt in 1758 made their way to Bermuda. Mackandal even had a college. He was a slave for what today is called Haiti. He ran into the hills, set up a maroon camp, and created a college for poisoning. Slaves were aware, bond people were aware of this. The point, with the internationalization of local trade and its success, there was an emergence of a contradiction in the body of slavery. The enslaved merchant mariner represented that contradiction. The maritime economy was making him richer, unknown to his slaveholders, the men who owned him. Or perhaps they didn't care up to a point. But then when restrictive legislation would be passed, particularly by the good Governor William Popple, as I said, the evil genius in this picture, suddenly they saw their profits being controlled. 1761 would make that necessary because 1761 they had to control the huge outflux, if I can use that word, of cattle going to wartime economies that Bermuda desperately needed. So that's the context. Let's take a look at the dramatis personae. There are three types: the Greek chorus, the pilots, and everybody else. The Greek chorus were the people who really weren't involved in it but just had what can only be called big mouth disease. Nat, more than likely, had no involvement in this, but his mouth was the loudest. He would pay a price for that, unfortunately, with his life. Probably in his 20s, he owned a cow. By the time of the revolt, he and his wife owned a cow. He belonged to Thomas Cox. The next one, Peter the pilot, probably a little bit more involved, but it's hard to say. He was a pilot of Margaret Spencer. So was Charles Cuff and Tom Cooper. All three of them were pilots. Their role is going to be essential. The rest, I believe, were probably, like the three pilots, were conspirators. Mingo, who belonged to Richard Jennings, Edward Parker, slave Peter, Joshua Prudence, slave Juan, and Elijah Prudence, slave Ben, Nancy, who belonged to Jonathan Tucker. All of these slaves were from the West End. All of this, an area that is notorious for revolts of this nature. Let me remind you that the Sarabassa revolt occurred. That was not a cheap shot against Somerset. This area was notorious for these revolts. It was also notorious for smuggling as well. So let's say, then there's the principal antagonist, known as William Popple, a man whose grandfather was a friend of John Locke, a man who believed in constitutional rights, but he was an empire man. Empire first. He found Bermuda difficult to take. Bermudians, he felt, did things regardless of imperial interest. He wrote a very long and very tedious, and I won't bore you with it, speech to some of his to the Bermudian Assembly, pleading with them not to be public men, but not to be private men, concerned with their own personal interest, but to be public men, concerned with the interest of the nation and interest of the empire. Of course, it all was on deaf ears. These guys could have cared less what he said. But for the most part, to put their private interest separate from the public interest of the imperial state. And he warned that this emphasis on parochialism and individualism, which was what he felt was prevalent throughout the island, was going to have a devastating effect on the economy. Or one day, sooner or later, slaves will take advantage of it, cut the island in half, because he pointed out they weren't separate, only the elite were. Popple himself found himself having to deal with this. They tried desperately to get him out of here. Through the years, he had one of the most difficult governorships in history. At one point, even the Speaker of the House, Cornelius Hinson, arranged to have a man shoot him in the head when he was on parade. This is a man who was completely unpopular. But the conspiracy of 1761 will completely change his reputation. Now the conspiracy. Two parts. First was the use of poison, potentially, and this is all hypothetical. One was the use of poison. Cyril Packwood in his book gave a very clear description of how this was to be carried out. Poison and the blade. Poison reflects the Mackinaw revolt, in which they would have utilized drop poison and kill everybody off that way. The blade that they would cut up and cut their throats in the night, to use a very descriptive term that Governor Popple said, they're going to rise up and they'll cut our throats in the night. Popple, by the way, was a playwright, so sometimes reading a lot of what his stuff is really actually entertaining. And some of the pot shots he takes against the local elite is actually even more entertaining. He should have been a stand-up comedian in terms of probably the only governor who could actually enjoy reading his stuff. Back then. 1764, the act of the use of poison was reflected. The members of the House of Assembly also noted about poison. They passed the Act for the Regulation of Negroes, Bond and Free in 1764, which specifically pointed out the use of poisoners who would masquerade their poisons as cures, particularly cures of smallpox. It may be interesting to note that the use of smallpox as a cure was known by many of these enslaved Africans very, very early, according to Cotton Mather. Good name to mention on Thanksgiving. Cotton Mather recalled how, without going into detail, had mentioned that there's not too big a difference between using it for poison and using it for cure, but I will go on a limb on that. I will mention, however, that there were other poisons, and members of the House of Assembly were aware of that. And finally, of course, the French connection. The argument was that the French privateers would join up and would actually join the slaves. These privateers, remember, were friends, or were connected with some of these slaveholders, some of these slaves, bond people. The idea was the pilots would meet them, bring them in, and then they would take over the country. The French connection was, remember, this is during the War of the 7 Years, during the 7 Years' War, and France at this moment was losing. Control of Bermuda would have been perfect for France. It would have then used it as a way of assailing shipping along the coast. They needed a division, and the slaves provided it. And finally, the fall. Popple leads the reaction. It's like a chess match for him. For him, it was a battle between the slaveholders were really a pawn in it, between Popple and the conspirators, in many ways. Popple attempted to try to control the reaction, as I said, it was like a chess match. He had to win over the slaveholders who didn't particularly like him, and the slaveholders who the slaves were trying to utilize in order to thwart the revolt. What he does, he tries to gain information. A tripartite scheme was set up in which he would offer bounty and freedom and guilty amnesty. That failed. Silence prevailed, and Popple did not know how to break it. So Popple was frustrated. He could not get the slaves to report on each other. Check. So Popple comes up with another system. And by the way, the proprietors are now concerned. All the slaves are being rounded up. All of them are being taken away. Now they're complaining. A household without slaves falls down pretty quickly in the 18th century. And that's what they were beginning to complain about. The slaves knew it. So Popple had to win them over. He basically allows them to set up a courts martial. Totally not, probably not the most legal thing he could have done, but anyway, allowed them to set up the court martial, as well as he gave them an opportunity to get rid of their rebellious slaves. The government won't do it, they will do it, and they would pay them for it. 1762 news about a conspirator. This worked, by the way. Slaveholders came on board. They finally, a large number of people were being expelled. By 1762, news of a potential break was coming. Jack Dare was reported to have information. Ephraim Gilbert reminded him of this, told Popple about this. He secured him away, but of course, Jack Dare disappeared. He didn't reappear until after the conflict in 1762. Epilogue. Popple managed to successfully crush the revolt through these means. He had 6 executions. Nat was executed. Peter was executed. Mingo was executed, as were Juan, Ben, and Nancy. The executions were purposeful. They were meant, as Popple said, to strike fear in the rest. This is a direct quote. The rest, others were expelled through generous compensation packages were offered to slaveholders as a result, to encourage their cooperation. Expulsions, the Popple purge saw at first time a diminution in the number of women in Bermuda's slave population. Laws were passed in other places to prevent other places from receiving Bermuda's rebellious slaves. Particularly the Bahamas passed a law to prevent this from happening. Punishments were also of pilots. Charles Cuff was forced into internal exile. Peter was not expelled, neither were Tom Cooper, but they were both, Charles Cuff, however, would never be allowed to involve himself in the trading system. New legislation was passed. Finally, there was an attempt to expel free blacks. Popple said no. That type of stuff's coming to an end. No longer will, he said, if gangster, I'll use his term for it. Remember, Popple's grandfather's friend was John Locke. His Majesty, they are free blacks, His Majesty's subjects, and this expelling them is not consistent with natural justice. So they would be allowed to stay. But for now, laws which were simply Negroes and other slaves were now laws passed bond and free. From 1764, free people will now be placed under severe restrictions. It's explicitly stated in the law. The legacy, bond people bond, blacks and slaves bond and free, will now live under a more restrictive system, and this will continue until 1828. In case you want to know, Popple did eventually return, and he died in 1764, no less than a month after he actually arrived. He was completely battered down. And since the revolt had an effect on him, I sometimes wonder if he was poisoned. But literally within a month, he was dead. Considering how young he was, this is rather exceptional. But then again, his relative, Alaric Popple, actually died in office. The conspiracy was nonetheless crushed. That would be the major revolt, would be the last major revolt in Bermuda, period. The one that occurred in the 1790s was not so much. This would be the last major revolt. And from that point forward, this is in spite of the fact that there were slave revolts elsewhere. Bermuda went quiet from the 18th to 19th century, while revolts occurred in basically other parts of the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very enlightening and passionately delivered talk. Banish the thought for those who want to hold on to the notion that slaves in Bermuda were docile and passive and accepted their lot. That's just not so. Our next speaker, Dr. Raydell Tankard, received his primary and high school education in Bermuda. In 1985, he enrolled at Cheney University in Pennsylvania and graduated in 1989 with a Bachelor of Science degree in secondary education. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Tankard returned to Bermuda and taught social studies in the public school system. In 1995, Dr. Tankard left Bermuda again to pursue graduate degree studies in African history at Howard University. He graduated from that program in 1997 and later enrolled in the PhD program in the Department of African Studies and Research at Howard. In 2003, Dr. Tankard obtained his doctorate degree upon completing his dissertation, which was entitled Migration and Economic Development, the Case of the Bermuda Brotherhood from Senegal to Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, 1990 to 2000. This research topic provided him with the opportunity to study and conduct research in Senegal and Gambia. Upon obtaining his PhD, Dr. Tankard was employed as a researcher at Howard University School of Law, where he worked with the steering committee commemorating the 1954 historic event of Brown versus Board of Education. Apart from working as a researcher, Dr. Tankard also worked as an adjunct faculty member in the history department at Howard University. Currently, Dr. Tankard is the director of Heritage Productions, a Bermudian organization designed to not only enhance and promote African Bermudian culture both locally and internationally, but also to work and establish economic, cultural, social, and religious relationships throughout the African diaspora. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Radau Tankard. Both our guest speakers today have asked that if you have questions, hold them until the end, and they will be happy and more than delighted to address the questions you may have. Dr. Tankard.
Good afternoon, Ms. Minister of Cultural Affairs, Mr. Wayne Perringer, the families, Packwood and the Robinson families, members of the Department of Cultural Affairs, ladies and gentlemen, students, greet you in peace. I'm humbled to be here this afternoon to be a part of this auspicious occasion. The gentlemen whom we are honoring this afternoon are giants, just as Ms. Whaling said earlier. And I want to share with you that their works not only has provided historical information for us here in Bermuda, but it has also provided us for a foundation for further study. And so for that reason, I'm eternally grateful to be here and to participate in this program today. And now to the topic at hand, the development of Islam in Bermuda. Let me just say, one of the reasons why I selected this topic is to, one, bring clarity to the religion of Islam, but more importantly, to share the story of an untold aspect of history here on the island. And so hopefully, within the next few minutes, I will shed some light on this development. Together with Christianity and Judaism, the religion of Islam is one of the three great world religions, widely known especially for contributions to human civilization in the areas of education, architecture, and trade. Islam has been placed at the center of world affairs since the catastrophic events of September 11, 2001, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Many, unfortunately, have a distorted view of this faith and fail to understand the true meaning of the religion. The word Islam is an Arabic word with a dual meaning. On the one hand, it can be translated to mean peace, while on the other, it can be interpreted as a submission to the will of God. The two meanings are interconnected in that it is only through submission to God's will that one can obtain peace. There are 5 pillars in the religion of Islam, and they include the Declaration of Faith, also known as the Shahada, which states that there is no God but God, or Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. The second pillar, prayer, whereby Muslims pray 5 times a day. The third pillar, charity, or zakat. Fourth, fasting during the month of Ramadan. And the fifth pillar, a trip to Mecca where Muslims meet others from all ethnic backgrounds to worship with their Lord. In addition to the 5 pillars of the faith, there are also 7 articles, which include belief in one God, in God's angels, in all of God's books and prophets, the day of resurrection and judgment, and that all power of doing proceeds from God, but that we as humans will all be responsible for our actions. The articles of faith found in Islam can also be found in Judaism and Christianity, thus confirming the basic principles of the three world's religions are basically the same. With this in mind, this paper seeks to discuss the development of Islam in Bermuda, beginning with the emergence of the Nation of Islam via the Muhammad Speaks newspaper in the early 1960s. This paper will also address the growth and expansion of the organization, as well as how the community transformed in 1975 from an institution of social reform to one practicing the pillars of the faith. Before doing so, however, it is necessary to give a brief overview about the Nation of Islam as a point of departure. The Nation of Islam was an organization established in the United States to assist and rid African Americans of the socioeconomic difficulties they experienced during the early years of the 20th century. The organization was also created to change the racial and social class distinction of the inequalities in America. Separation from mainstream America was a major philosophy of the Nation of Islam, which centers on the belief that Africans forced to come to America would never obtain freedom, justice, and equality as citizens of the United States. Truth be told, that this notion was not a new concept, and that several other social reform attempts had been made by other blacks who tried to escape the oppressive treatment inflicted on them by whites since the emancipation of slavery. For example, Paul Coffey, Henry Garnett, Martin Delany, and Edward Wilmot all sought to escape white oppression in America. Upon becoming leader of the Nation of Islam, and after taking over from Wali Fard Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad grew the organization both socially and economically. He enforced a strict dress code for the members and implemented the positions of captains and lieutenants. He also established the Muhammad Speaks newspaper, created in 1959 by Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, better known as Malcolm X. Economically, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad imported whiting fish from Peru, Chinaware from China, leather goods from Pakistan, sardines from Morocco, and coffee from Africa. Additionally, the Nation of Islam owned many facilities, including clothing stores, bakeries, a financial bank, farms in Michigan and Georgia, and the plant that produced the Muhammad Speaks newspaper. The emergence of the Nation of Islam via the Muhammad Speaks in Bermuda occurred in the midst of the civil rights struggle on the island. African Bermudians, for example, had just won a major civil rights victory with the desegregation of Bermuda's theaters. Led by the progressive group, blacks stayed away from their favorite pastime for about 2 weeks. And on July 2nd, 1959, the doors of Bermuda's theaters were open again, but this time it was with the discrimination policy in place. Shortly thereafter, and around about the time as the Muhammad Speaks first hit the local streets, the Universal Adult Suffrage Campaign was underway, and leading this charge was none other than Dr. Paulo Carmo-Figo, also known as Roosevelt Brown. In 1960 and the following year, African Bermudians were successful in having established the Restaurant Act that desegregated restaurants in Bermuda. This act deemed it unlawful for a restaurateur to refuse to admit or serve in his restaurant any person by reason of that person's race, color, religion, or national origin. This victory later led to the establishment of the 1967 Hotel Act of Bermuda, which granted African Bermudians similar privileges as the Restaurant Act. Suffice it to say, by the 1963, there were both institutions and individuals from within the African Bermudian community fighting for civil rights. Among them were the Friendly Societies of Bermuda, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Progressive Labor Party, and a few courageous young black Bermudians selling the Muhammad Speaks newspaper. Some of the very first copies of the newspaper were circulated by Mr. Kenneth Castle Sr. and Saeed Ramadan. These two gentlemen can be regarded as some of the very first Bermudians to enhance the philosophy of the Nation of Islam. They distributed the papers regularly and tirelessly throughout the local community. Eventually, both the Nation of Islam and the Muhammad Speaks became appealing to African Bermudians, not only because the organization and the paper addressed the socioeconomic inequalities and injustices in America, but also because popular individuals such as Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali were actively involved in the organization. To this end, members from the organization met each Friday to send money overseas to Amir Abdullah, also known as Byron Phillip, the African Bermudian studying at the Brooklyn Temple. He later sent papers back to Bermuda. It must be noted, however, that some people within the African Bermudian community became a little apprehensive about the Muhammad Speaks newspaper because it appeared that the content of the publication seemed to counter the attitude of those who were trying to work with, quote unquote, the white man to change the injustices and inequalities that plague the local society. With this being the case, the police frequently made unexpected visits to the homes of the brothers selling the newspapers. Eventually, the Muhammad Speaks was banned by the former ruling government, the United Bermuda Party. Dame Lois Brown Evans, who was then Deputy Premier of the Progressive Labor Party, protested against the governor's decision to ban the newspaper. Meanwhile, in January 1965, racial tensions had escalated to an all-time high on the island, and Bermuda experienced the Belco riots. The riots lasted for approximately 2 weeks, after which a truce was struck, following ongoing discussion with local authorities. The Belco riots had an immediate impact on the Brothers of the Nation of Islam, in that it allowed them to unite after a short split due to a dispute regarding the sale of the newspapers. With excitement in the air, they put their differences aside and came together, realizing that the goals of the group were far greater than their petty differences. By 1971, development within the Nation of Islam was well underway, thanks in part to Wali Muhammad and his wife, Usulama Muhammad. The couple had just returned to Bermuda after living in Chicago. Upon returning home and consulting with Ernie Dunlop, Wali Muhammad was able to put into place a framework of the organization similar to that found at the headquarters in the Windy City. For example, captains and lieutenants were added to the existing organizational positions. There were 2 captains in total, with 1 for each gender group. Next in line to the captains were the lieutenants, and each gender group had 3 representatives. Coupled with the new positions, a series of classes were added to the organization, and they included the Fruit of Islam, Muslim Girls Training, and the General Civilization class. The Fruit of Islam was held for brothers only. It was based on physical training in the form of martial arts. The Muslim Girls Training taught women how to cook, sew, clean, and care for their newborn babies. The sisters also searched the local community to find out if other females were safe and secure. The final class implemented in the local Nation of Islam organization was the General Civilization class. This class involved maintaining the highest standards of good hygiene and high morals. Heavy emphasis was placed on cleanliness, good manners, and a positive attitude. Amazingly, this development, combined with the establishment of Muslim restaurants and businesses, allowed members of the organization to become involved in the broader community of Bermuda, thus heightening the public awareness of the local movement, while simultaneously making way for Byron Phillip, the person to advance the organization locally. By 1972, the organization was a force to be reckoned with Minister Byron Phillip building upon the existing framework. He also identified the organization's core beliefs, aims, and rules, and increased both local membership and the number of businesses within the organization. By 1974, the organization was able to change its location and move to a larger place of facility. The members of the organization left the Bassett building on Court Street and moved on to Curving Avenue in Hamilton. In 1975, they purchased their own property on Cedar Avenue. Undoubtedly, the year 1975 will not be forgotten by members of the Nation of Islam, both in the United States and Bermuda. It began with the passing of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, which resulted in his son, Worth D. Muhammad, becoming the new leader of the organization. This event occurred around the same time as the annual Savior's Day Convention. Henceforth, the 1975 convention was a defining moment for the organization in more ways than one, in that not only was it the passing of the baton from father to son, but more importantly, it marked the transition from the Nation of Islam, Black Islam, to Orthodox Islam. With this new development, Imam Muhammad brought a new light or mindset to a community that was steeped in the ignorance about Islam. Through his teachings, Many of the supporters of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and others became aware of the correct and proper understanding of Islam. The teachings of Imam Muhammad gave a new spiritual life to the Muslim community and to the broader community of America. Howard University's esteemed scholar, Dr. Suleiman Yang, put it this way: when Imam Muhammad ascended to the reins as leader of the Nation of Islam, the Imam expanded the community in a peaceful and bloodless manner. In the process, he has led the community to another level whereby it has become a moral business economy and a high level of professionalism. This advancement has resulted in Imam Muhammad playing a significant role with respect to Muslim influence not only in America, but also throughout the world. Clearly, from the moment Imam Muhammad assumed the leadership, he demonstrated courage, vision, and vigor as he went about introducing the members of the Nation of Islam to the correct teachings of Islam, beginning with the Shahada, or the Declaration of Faith. He also taught them about Prophet Muhammad and the Quran. The Nation of Islam's core beliefs and false concepts, such as Master Muhammad as God in the form of man, and the myth that his father Elijah Muhammad as the final messenger of God, were erased from the minds of the former members of the Nation of Islam. To his credit, Imam Muhammad disseminated the correct information about Islam through various mediums such as the Muslim paper, radio talk shows, speeches, and public lectures. Imam Muhammad also worked to eliminate the misconception that the Caucasian race or white race is a grafted race. This was a common view previously held by the members of the Nation of Islam during his father's reign. Admittingly, many became uncomfortable with the shift in the Nation of Islam's belief system, organizational structure, and new psyche. Some followers rejected the new direction and decided to walk away from Imam Muhammad's leadership, primarily because the transformation brought about had many changes. Nevertheless, spearheading this effort in Bermuda was Albert Muhammad. He worked to implement the fundamentals of Islam, with Imam Muhammad assisting him along the way. In 1976, the world Muslim leader made his first trip to Bermuda. This visit proved extremely beneficial and inspiring, as he removed the cloud of doubt hanging over the island about the future destiny of the local Muslim community. Playing an instrumental role in establishing the remaining principles of Islam in Bermuda was Nasheed Memrani, who became the new Muslim leader and held on to the post from 1978 to 1981. He held control of its properties, opened a Claret Muhammad School, and hosted several local and international conferences. Now, under the leadership of Imam Basim Muwakil, the community participates in activities such as interfaith dialogues, the Bermuda Day Parade, politics, and a host of other community activities. In conclusion, it can be said that the earliest rumblings of Islam in Bermuda began in the 1960s, and that the development of the religion is inextricably tied to the civil rights struggle on the island. Admittingly, while the Nation of Islam was not a religious organization, it was, however, a social avenue for a group of African Bermudians to deal with the injustices and the inequalities inflicted on them and others by the ruling elite of the country. The passing of the Nation of Islam leader, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, paved the way for his son, Warthin Muhammad, to introduce to his followers and others the correct teachings of Islam, which is a universal and comprehensive way of life which embraces all people, all cultures, and all ethnicities. In closing, I want to thank the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs for inviting me to share this aspect of Bermuda's rich history. Thank you, and may God's peace and blessings be with you all.
For your talk and showing the connections and the relationship between Islam and the civil rights movement here in Bermuda and parallels in the United States. Dr. Tankard made reference to the Progressive Group, which was a group that fought very much undercover, behind the scenes, for the desegregation. And in our midst today, Dr. Clifford Maxwell, who was a member of that Progressive Group, and they only in 1998, I think it was, made themselves known. So he too is one of our unsung heroes, and I'd like for us to acknowledge Dr. Maxwell's presence. my former principal at the Barclay. Pardon me, I thought she was, and Mrs. Florence Webb Maxwell. They're the parents of Dr. Clarence Maxwell. Mrs. Maxwell, you want to stand so that the young people can see who you are? These are two of our unsung heroes who worked diligently to bring about the ending of segregation in Bermuda, something that young people, you would have no idea what that was like. We also acknowledge the presence today of another historian, Mr. James Smith. Thank you, Mr. Smith, for your presence here this afternoon. And he serves with Dr. Kim Dismount Robinson on the Historical Heartbeats Lecture Series Committee, organizing the lectures. So, Mr. Smith, thank you very much. He's author of Slavery in Bermuda. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present to you our minister, the Honorable Wayne Parent-Chief, CPM, JP, MP. Minister?
With some of the people that I know, Dr. Clifford Maxwell and his wife and family. I see Jennifer Guy in Walshouse, my good classmate, Dolly Palmer. I see also Sir Pearman. I'm especially happy to see young people here today. And you're from Cedar Bridge, I believe. What is the occasion?
I teach a comparative religion class, and one of the religions we cover is Islam, so I wanted them to get the information on Islam, the start of it in Bermuda.
Fantastic. I must congratulate you on your decorum and your patience. And I'm always happy to see young people involved in learning about their heritage, because many of us, older folk, and I'm 65 now, had to learn our heritage from either our parents or from teachers, very, very strong-willed teachers. The Nation of Islam, as many of us know, had a very difficult, if you like, start in Bermuda. And it was part of our social revolution of inclusiveness, to include all of you. The fact that we sit here today as an integrated group in this particular club, which used to be segregated way back in the day, is a testament and testimony to how far we've come. And many people tend to not want to put a spotlight on our troubled past and our divided past, but sometimes it's good to remember the path that you've trod, so that you don't stumble when you traverse the path of your future. And there's nothing wrong with remembering and moving on. Having said all that, I should get to my prepared text. I know you all have to, I know you've all had a long day. As the Minister of Community and Cultural Affairs, I am very pleased to be here, and especially to pay homage to the memory of two Bermudian historians who contributed so much to our understanding of our past, and by extension, our present. I'm also very pleased that members of the families are able to join us today to celebrate the legacy of our heritage, to borrow the title of Dr. Robinson's book, A Heritage That Includes and Goes Beyond the Era when our ancestors were chained on the rock, to also borrow the title of Mr. Packwood's book. Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson and Mr. Cyril Packwood were very different men, and they both contributed a unique legacy of public service to both Bermuda and the international community. And however, despite whatever differences in circumstances, generation, method, or focus might distinguish the work of Dr. Robinson and Mr. Packwood, they shared a core similarity that makes it possible to honor them both with this lecture. They were committed to bringing to light parts of our history that have been lost, ignored, or forgotten. They went about their task with thoughtfulness, thoroughness, and dedication that guarantees their legacies will stand the test of time. And what better way to honor their memories than by highlighting the research by two of the finest Bermudian historians of this generation, Dr. Clarence Maxwell, that's Junior. And I got a little bit confused. I said, I wonder if it's father or son. But I'm especially elated to see two Bermudian men here, two generations of Bermudian men who are carrying on the tradition of educating our people. And Dr. Riddell Tankard, I was especially happy with your topic. It takes a brave man this day and age to traverse the perils of explaining religion. And many of us get entangled in that and don't extricate ourselves. But thank you very much for your very enlightening topic. So please join me in thanking these two young men who, through their participation today, have helped carry the torches lit by Dr. Robinson and Mr. Packwood, ensuring that the many diverse threads of our history shall not be forgotten.
Thank you. On behalf of my mother and our family, this gives us great pleasure. Gives us great pleasure to be associated with this particular venture. My son expressed our sentiments, and my father would be ever so pleased and proud that these two young men, who I've had the good fortune of connecting with, are presenting to young people. My father's heart is with young people and education, and I know that he's up there very proud that the Community and Cultural Affairs has taken this bold step where our young men are being focused after so many years of study, hard work, that they can carry on the mantle, because you young people, somebody here will be standing up here, and hopefully I'll be out to hear you the way my mother of 1906 is out. So, make sure you do it well. Thank you again.
Ms. Cheryl Packwood, the daughter of Mr. Cyril Packwood, would you come forward now, please?
Thank you very much. Again, thank you, Minister, thank you, Ms. Whalen. This has been an honor and a pleasure. On behalf of my mother, my son, my two other sons that are not here, and Aneda, thank you for this tribute.
Dr. Maxwell and Dr. Tankard, would you come forward now, please?
I'll let Ms. Whalen explain what this is. It looks like something that's negotiable money.
Yes.
I have to be very careful as to what to look at that.
That's right. Well, the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs, we're very pleased with both these gentlemen coming and having done their research and presenting their talks. And we recognize that they put in considerable work and effort, and this is a small token of our appreciation to them. So on behalf of the minister and the entire staff, and Dr. Dismont Robinson is not here, thank you very much for your work and your effort, and may you continue. Thank you. I don't know if any of the young people had questions for either of our speakers, or if any of the other members of the audience had questions. If not, did I see somebody? Yes.
I feel like Oprah. Probably, my guess is that some did go to the Bahamas, but I think some may have gone to Saint Domingue, which demanded a large number of slaves for its plantation. I think many of them probably went to North America. The North American colonies might have shown up there, particularly Maryland. But I think for the most part, they were most of them I suspect were women.
There's a question in the back.
The journal, the museum journal, it does have articles. Many of the articles go into the museum's journal, Bermuda Journal of Archaeology, Maritime History. Thank you.
If I may add, also the journal Slavery and Abolition is available in college libraries.
Will these lectures be available for public use?
In another medium other than this forum here? I was thinking that when we were sitting down, and we will talk with our technicians and see if we can have them put on CD so that, yes, they can be, and also to replay them at another time during the year, because the information is valuable. Absolutely. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Then, we have.
We're supposed to be starting the study of Islam shortly. Right now, Mrs. Silver is teaching it. I taught it for a few years, and I was wondering if we can have a copy of your speech to include in what we would teach on the local aspect of Islam.
Certainly the department wants copies of both speeches.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, it now is my duty and privilege to thank you all for coming to this, our first annual Robinson Packwood Memorial Lecture. Hopefully you have been stimulated and edified. And as it's Thanksgiving, thank you, and may God bless you as you leave. Bye-bye.